Hello, my name is Alex Isles and welcome to Ad Gefrin in Northumberland. And in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the history and chronology of Ad Gefrin. Now, the interesting thing is the archaeologist who actually excavated Ad Gefrin is a man by the name of Brian Hope Taylor. And Brian Hope Taylor was working with what he had at the time. And that time, he was looking at the history of the Kingdom of Northumbria. And as I mentioned in the introduction video, we would never know that this here was Ad Gefrin or Gefrin Bell just behind me if it wasn't for the fact that Brian Hope Taylor had Bede. Now, Bede, in his writing of the history of the English peoples, gives an understanding or an overview of what he saw as the history of the English peoples from the information he had at his time. So he's writing from a collection of Roman materials, he's looking at native British materials that he's getting through the church, he's got some Irish materials as well, and alongside that he's got the folklore of his people. And this is the history that he's working from. So when he writes down, he's writing it from what he knows rather than the facts of archaeology that we have, the science and the much more codified nature of history that we have today. That means that it's a lot more of a sort of higgledy-piggledy story than what we would love to have, which would be, we'd love Bede to write down, oh, in the year such and such and such and such, they built a hall that was this big and that sort of stuff. We would love something like that. We would love, you know, if the historians like Tacitus could write exactly in this year the Romans did this, or they built this city, or they did that, so that we could go along and go, oh yeah, the history is so certain. But it's not like that, because Bede isn't writing history for the purposes of like dating down times and dates and all of that sort of stuff. Bede's entire purpose is to tell a story of how the English people went from being in the darkness of paganism to the light of the relationship with God and Christianity. And so it's an interesting one then when we're looking at it, because we can't judge Bede by our modern standards of history and culture. We have to judge him by the fact that he's trying to tell us a story and a narrative of his time with the material that he actually has. So because of that, Brian Hope Taylor took that and he placed it onto Ad Gefrin right here. And so just in front of me you can see a rough outline of the history of Ad Gefrin. So to start off with, they start off with what Bede tells us, which is that in the year 548, you know, there is a warlord called Ida. He comes up the Northumbrian coast and he takes over the land around Bamborough and Lindisfarne and settles in that area, fighting against native British chieftains. So because of that, around about halfway through the 6th century, Brian Hope Taylor says they start constructing things on the site here at Ad Gefrin. And so you can see in this panel just below me here, they put a date of around about 580 AD for the idea of when they're constructing this here. Now after Ida, there's a number of other kings until you get to Ida's grandson, Aelfrith. And Aelfrith is an incredibly powerful king of Northumbria, and he manages to subjugate kingdoms in southern Scotland. He subjugates kingdoms around Yorkshire, in the northwest of Britain around Cumbria, and also goes right the way down into sort of fighting against kings in the Midlands, and he becomes what's known as a Bretwald, or a High King of all Britain. And so when they see the expansion of Ad Gefrin right here, with constructions of like the grandstand, which is a feature which we'll talk about in another video soon, or a large seated platform very similar to a Roman amphitheatre in many ways, the constructions of great halls and also the other buildings here, immediately, you know, we start seeing the sort of the history bleeding through into the archaeology, or at least Bede's history. Because Brian Hope Taylor went, well, Bede writes this, therefore we see this being built, so we'll pin that onto Aelfrith. And earlier on, Ida is known as a strong Germanic war leader, so we'll connect on to Ida, that Germanic temple complex over there, and the construction initially of the palisade enclosure just over there. And so the palisade enclosure, which is this massive, what Brian Hope Taylor thought of as a cattle corral, is then connected to Ida. We then see Edwin come onto the scene after the death of Aelfrith. So Aelfrith is killed by Edwin. Edwin comes up here, he converts to Christianity, and we see Paulinus's baptism. So that's when they start seeing more of these larger halls being built, and Brian Hope Taylor says, well, what happened is Edwin came along and he's baptizing in this area, so the grand hall that is constructed on this area will connect that to Edwin. And then following on from that, Edwin dies in battle against Cadwalla. So what he does next is he says, right, Edwin dies, and in Bede's story we hear how for 2 years they actually set fire to Northumbria, and there was widespread raiding by Penda, king of Mercia, and Cadwalla. So when we have this, we know that at that time as well, Penda is, able to do large-scale raids into Northumbria. So what we've got there is another situation where we see, here the archaeology showed that the site had been burnt to the ground. When the site was burnt to the ground, what then happens, well, or at least most of the sites burnt to the ground, is that they connect it to that. They say, right, okay, that was the raid by Penda, and that was the destruction right there, or the raid by Cadwalla. You then have Oswald come along, and so because of that, you see the site being rebuilt, you see halls being remodeled, new buildings being added. And so because of that, then what again Brian Hope Taylor says is Oswald's come along, he re-establishes it, but he doesn't rebuild the massive cattle corral, because Bede says is that after a certain point they moved from Ad Gefrin to Mailmin, which is slightly further up here and has been associated with the modern day town of Millfield in Northumberland. So he then goes, well, the great enclosure isn't built there, so then because of that we now know that they've moved across, but this is still a royal site, this is still a location that is important to the people up here in Northumbria. And then finally it's burnt down again, which he then associates with the death of Oswald. Again, Penda is then able to raid into Northumbria. Penda even besieges Bamborough Castle, so he says the burning of the site to the ground again is Oswald's period. And then there's a final period which he then associates with Oswiu, which is his brother, and so Oswiu then rebuilds the site and it is still used as a royal site. Interestingly enough, in the late period we see a church pop up in the east end of the site, which possibly even could be later, it could be 8th century. Archaeologists have been looking at that. So what the whole issue there is, what I'm going to talk about next, is that Brian Hope Taylor took that chronology from Bede, but he didn't do carbon dating, radiocarbon dating. Now if he'd done radiocarbon dating, or at least kept samples of all of the buildings that he was digging up around here, then later archaeologists would be able to assess the wood, assess the organic materials, and actually give much more stable dating to the whole site right here. The problem was that when he was doing it, it was a very early science, and so you could only get a 50-year window. And he's going, well, I don't need a 50-year window. I believe the whole site dates to the 6th and 7th centuries. I know this from Bede, therefore I'm not going to bother doing that. And so this is an example for us today where even when a new technology comes out, or a new form of dating history, or a new understanding of things, we always have to take a hold of what's been there before, but also very much lean into and grab a hold of the new stuff and keep things for future generations. Because if you don't keep things for future generations, then it's a lot harder to actually date a site like this. Because even though a lot of what he says does seem to line up, and it seems that yes, we can date each period of Ad Gefrin and the site right here to various kings of Northumbria and different points of history, and the burnings down of the site do seem to line up with Cadwalla and Penda's attacks on Northumbria. At the same time, we would love to know if that was just another raid by another king, or something that even that Bede didn't record. Could this be centuries apart? I'm going to throw something out there which I don't believe, but what if the burning of a second time was actually to do with the Great Heathen Army in the 9th century? Now, I don't think that's the case whatsoever. I'm just throwing it out there as an example of where, because of Brian Hope Taylor's certainty of how he was doing the archaeology, we may have lost out on history. And again, we have to then also at the same time not throw Bede out with the bathwater and suddenly go, oh, Bede wasn't reliable because he was trying to tell a Christian story. No, instead we have to know that we only know this site here is Ad Gefrin because of Bede. So it's one of those where we look at it and it's actually that tension of history, that tension of going, well, actually we have the historical sources from the time which are not as pure history or written in the same way as we have the art of history today, but we also have to grab a hold of scientific techniques, studies, research, genetics, isotopes, all of these different things, so that we can tell a story and understand the past of how we got to be here today. But at the same time, understand that while we're telling this story, we've got our own biases just as much as Bede had. So I really hope you've enjoyed the video today, and I've been able to bring to life some of the Anglo-Saxon history from the sources that we have, the archaeology and the studies, and using Brian Hope Taylor as an example of how, you know, there's amazing research that he did, but there were flaws in it as well. As always, please do like and subscribe, write a comment below, and I'll try and answer your questions or point you in the right direction of some information I've learnt. And if you would like to, I've got a Patreon where you can support me as well. In the meantime though, stay safe and well, and I hope you'll join me for another video in the near future. Thank you very much. Five, four, three, two, one.